He was not born on a throne where power and privilege awaited him, nor did he command vast armies that could bend the world to his will through force and domination. Instead, he walked through the dust and stone of an occupied land, carrying nothing but the weight of a vision that no one around him could fully comprehend. A man whose footsteps echoed with the quiet determination of someone who had chosen a path that would lead him not toward glory, but toward something far more demanding and far more dangerous. This was a man who felt the sharp pangs of hunger gnawing at his stomach during long days of wandering, who experienced the crushing weight of betrayal from those he had trusted most deeply, and who carried within himself questions that haunted his sleepless nights beneath the stars. History, with its relentless need to simplify and sanctify, turned him into a symbol that transcended the boundaries of human experience, transforming flesh and doubt into marble and certainty. But symbols bleed when you look closely enough at them. Symbols carry the trembling uncertainty of the human heart, and before the weight of his destiny came crashing down upon his shoulders, even he found himself trembling in the darkness, wrestling with fears that no amount of faith could instantly dissolve. This is not the story of a God who walked among men without truly understanding their struggles and limitations, observing humanity from some elevated plane of divine detachment, where suffering becomes merely theatrical. This is the journey of a man among men, someone who understood intimacy with pain because he lived it in his bones, who knew the particular loneliness that comes from carrying a vision that isolates you from everyone you love, and who paid the ultimate price for daring to believe that the world could be something other than what it was, for daring to imagine that love might be stronger than the iron fist of empire. Today, we uncover the human truth that lies beneath centuries of theology and doctrine, the doubt that made his courage meaningful, the vulnerability that made his strength genuine, the solitude that forged his vision, and the unwavering conviction that changed the course of human history not through miracles alone, but through the raw, uncompromising power of a life lived in absolute alignment with purpose. Act 1. The man before the symbol. Long before the world knew his name or attached meaning to his existence, before the weight of prophecy and expectation settled onto his shoulders like chains made of hope and desperation, there was simply a young man growing up in the harsh beauty of Galilee, where the land itself taught lessons about endurance, and where survival required a quiet strength that had nothing to do with miracles. He was born into modesty, into a world where his hands would become calloused from working with wood and stone, where the rhythm of his days followed the ancient patterns of labor that had sustained his people for generations, and where the gap between the powerful and the powerless was not just visible, but violently enforced by an empire that ruled through fear and the systematic crushing of hope. His childhood was not filled with visions of grandeur, but with the simple observations of someone who paid attention to the world around him, who noticed the way Roman soldiers looked at his people with contempt, who saw hunger in the eyes of children who had done nothing to deserve such suffering, and who felt something stirring within himself that refused to accept that this was simply the natural order of things that must be endured without question. As he grew into young adulthood, working beside his father in the workshop where silence often spoke louder than words, he found himself wrestling with questions that most people learn to bury beneath the daily struggle for survival. Questions about the meaning of a life lived under occupation, about whether goodness had any power in a world that seemed to reward only violence and domination, and about what it meant to be truly free when every aspect of existence was controlled by forces that cared nothing for the dignity of the human spirit. He observed the suffering of his people not with the detached curiosity of a philosopher safely removed from pain, but with the intimate knowledge of someone who shared their struggles, who understood what it meant to live with the constant awareness that your life could be taken on a whim, that your labor enriched those who despised you, and that the gods seemed distant and unconcerned with the daily crucifixions that happened not on crosses, but in the slow grinding down of human hope. Yet within this darkness, something began to take shape in his mind and heart, a vision that was not yet fully formed, but that pulled at him with increasing urgency, a sense that there might be another way to live that did not require either submission to tyranny or the embrace of violence that would simply create new tyrants. He began to see that true strength might not reside in the sword or in the ability to dominate others, but in something far more radical and far more difficult, a kind of inner sovereignty that no empire could touch, a way of being in the world that refused to let external circumstances determine the content of one's character. This was the birth of a philosophy that would later be mistaken for religion, a set of principles that emerged not from revelation alone, but from years of observation, contemplation, and the slow forging of conviction in the furnace of lived experience. The seeds of wisdom that would eventually grow into teachings that challenged the foundations of the established order were planted in these quiet years of apprenticeship and observation, years when he learned the disciplines of patience and craftsmanship, when he discovered that true mastery required the subordination of ego to purpose, and when he began to understand that the greatest revolution would not be fought with weapons, but with the transformative power of an idea lived out with absolute integrity. He learned what the Stoics would later articulate with such clarity, that we cannot control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond, that virtue is not the reward for good behavior, but the behavior itself, and that genuine freedom exists only in the space between stimulus and response, in that sacred moment where we choose who we will be regardless of what the world demands of us. Act 2. The weight of vision. The moment he stepped beyond the familiar boundaries of his workshop and his village, the moment he began to speak publicly about the vision that had been growing within him for years, he crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, and he felt immediately the crushing weight of what it means to carry a message that threatens the foundations of the world as it is currently constructed. To announce a new way of being in a world that had long ago settled into comfortable patterns of oppression and collaboration with oppression was not simply to offer an alternative perspective that people could consider at their leisure. It was to declare war on every system that depended on fear, hierarchy, and the belief that some human beings were inherently more valuable than others. The resistance he encountered was not merely intellectual disagreement, but visceral hostility from those whose power depended on maintaining the status quo, who saw in his words not theological innovation, but existential threat, and who would stop at nothing to silence a voice that suggested that the emperor had no clothes and that God might actually prefer the company of the despised and rejected. He found himself caught in the impossible tension between being seen as an icon, a symbol of hope for the desperate and downtrodden who projected onto him all their dreams of liberation and transformation, and remaining grounded in his own humanity, his own doubts, his own weariness at the end of long days when the crowds wanted miracles but seemed deaf to the deeper message about the revolution that had to happen within each human heart before any external change could be meaningful. The pressure from those in power intensified with each passing day, as the religious authorities recognized a challenger to their monopoly on divine interpretation, and the Roman occupiers saw the seeds of rebellion in any gathering that suggested there might be a higher law than Caesar's decree. He was watched constantly, his words dissected for evidence of sedition, his followers questioned and intimidated, and the net of conspiracy began to tighten around him in ways that he could feel even when he could not yet see the full dimensions of what was being planned in the moments of silence between public appearances. In the hours before dawn, when he withdrew to pray or meditate or simply sit with the weight of what he carried, the internal conflict became almost unbearable, a war between the calling he felt with such certainty and the very human desire to turn away from a path that was clearly leading towards suffering and possibly death. Why me? He must have asked in those dark hours. What peculiar combination of fate and choice has placed this burden on my shoulders when I am no less fragile and fearful than any other man who walks this earth? He looked at the faces of those who followed him, seeing their mixture of genuine transformation and dangerous misunderstanding. People who loved him but did not always comprehend what he was actually saying, who wanted a king or a magician or a military leader when what he was offering was something far more demanding and far less immediately gratifying than conquest or supernatural intervention. The fatigue went deeper than physical exhaustion, settling into his bones and spirit as a profound weariness that came from the loneliness of vision, from being the one who saw something that others could not yet perceive, from carrying knowledge of what must come while those around him still believed in happy endings, and divine intervention that would spare them all from the consequences of challenging an empire. He was like Socrates facing the hostility of Athens for daring to question the comfortable lies that held society together, or like Marcus Aurelius bearing the weight of empire, while knowing that power corrupts and that every decision he made would have consequences he could not fully control or predict. The burden of leadership, when you truly understand what you are asking of people and what you are risking yourself, is not the glorious calling of legend, but the daily choice to continue walking forward when every instinct of self-preservation screams at you to turn back, to compromise, to find some middle path that might allow you to survive. Yet he continued, driven by something deeper than fear or hope, by conviction that had been tested and tempered through years of contemplation and was now hard as iron, flexible as water, and unbreakable in its core commitment to a truth that transcended personal comfort or safety. He understood what the Stoic philosophers articulated so clearly, that we are not here merely to survive, but to live according to nature, according to the highest principles we can perceive, and that the quality of our character is determined not by what happens to us, but by how we respond to what happens to us. The weight of vision pressed down on him with increasing force, but he had made his choice, had accepted his fate in the deepest sense that the ancients spoke of amor fati, the love of one's destiny, even when that destiny leads through darkness toward an end that promises not triumph, but transformation through sacrifice. Act 3, betrayal, doubt, and the ultimate test. The mechanisms of betrayal set themselves in motion not with the sudden shock of unexpected treachery, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of human nature, confronting forces too large and too terrifying to resist without the kind of courage that most people simply do not possess. And Judas was not the monster that later storytelling would make him, but rather a man caught in the machinery of empire and religious authority. Someone who made the calculation that so many have made throughout history, that personal survival matters more than abstract principles, that 30 pieces of silver represent tangible security, while loyalty to a condemned man offers only the certainty of sharing his fate. The betrayal cut deep not because it was unexpected, for he had seen it coming with the clarity that comes from truly understanding human nature in all its weakness and potential nobility, but because it confirmed the profound isolation that comes from walking a path that others can admire from a distance, but cannot finally walk themselves when the cost becomes too high and the threat too immediate. As the final hours approached and the net closed around him with terrible precision, he experienced the abandonment not just of those who had promised to stand with him until death, but of that sense of divine presence that had sustained him through years of opposition and hardship. And he found himself facing what every human being who truly commits to something larger than themselves must eventually face. The moment when all external support falls away and you are left alone with nothing but your own conviction to sustain you against overwhelming darkness. The Garden of Gethsemane became the stage for the most profound crisis of his entire journey, where the abstract philosophy of acceptance and courage confronted the concrete reality of imminent torture and death, where the vision he had carried for so long suddenly seemed impossibly heavy, and the path forward seemed not like destiny, but like madness, like volunteering for destruction when escape might still be possible if he just abandoned this impossible mission and disappeared into the vast landscape of the empire, where one more Galilean peasant would never be noticed or remembered. He did not walk toward what awaited him with the serene confidence of someone who knows that divine intervention will save them at the last moment, or that their suffering will be brief and painless. Instead, he walked with the terrible knowledge of exactly what torture the Romans had perfected over centuries of maintaining their empire through strategic brutality. He knew what crucifixion meant not as abstract concept, but as hours of suffocation and agony stretched out under the sun while crowds jeered and soldiers gambled for your clothing beneath the cross. The prayer that rose from his lips in that garden was not the calm acceptance of someone beyond fear, but the desperate cry of a man who still had to choose, who had not yet committed irrevocably to the path that he could see stretching before him, who wanted with every fiber of his being for there to be another way, some alternative that would not require him to endure what he knew was coming. "Let this cup pass from me" was not weakness, but honesty, the acknowledgement that courage is not the absence of fear, but action taken despite fear, so overwhelming that it threatens to unmake you completely. That true strength reveals itself not in feeling no terror, but in feeling all the terror and still choosing to move forward, because something matters more than survival, more than comfort, more than the very reasonable desire to not be tortured to death before you reach the age of 40. This was the moment of amor fati in its purest and most terrible form. Not the philosophical acceptance of minor inconveniences, but the embrace of a destiny that promised nothing but suffering in service of a vision whose vindication he would not live to see, whose success was uncertain, and whose meaning might be distorted by those who came after and as something unrecognizable. The silence of the universe in that moment was deafening, the absence of any clear sign or voice of reassurance that what he was choosing made sense or would matter in the long arc of history. And yet from somewhere within that profound silence and that crushing doubt, he found or created or discovered the strength to stand up from his prayer, to wipe the sweat from his face, and to walk forward toward the torches of those who came to arrest him, toward the machinery of state violence that would grind him down, toward the cross that waited like a dark prophecy about to fulfill itself. The courage this required was not superhuman, but deeply human. Not the courage of someone who cannot feel pain, but of someone who feels it entirely and chooses meaning over comfort, purpose over survival, love over the hate that would have been so much easier to embrace in the face of what the world was about to do to him. Act 4. Resilience, sacrifice, and the birth of legacy. In those final hours when pain and humiliation were meant to break him completely, to reduce him to nothing more than a warning to others who might dare to challenge the established order or speak dangerous truths about alternative ways of being human, something unexpected revealed itself in the way he carried the weight of suffering that would have crushed most people into bitterness and despair. The moments of his execution became not a defeat, but a demonstration of the ultimate form of emotional mastery, the kind of sovereignty over one's own responses that the Stoics spoke of as the highest achievement of human wisdom. And this mastery revealed itself not through supernatural intervention or miraculous escape, but through the quality of his presence in the midst of conditions designed specifically to destroy human dignity and reduce a person to an animal state of pure suffering and survival instinct. When he looked at those who tortured him, at the soldiers following orders, and the crowd that had turned from adulation to bloodlust with the fickleness that crowds have always shown throughout history, and spoke words of forgiveness rather than curse, he was not engaging in some theatrical performance of divinity, but demonstrating that even in extremis, even when every external circumstance screams for vengeance and hate, the human will retain the power to choose the content of its character, to refuse to let circumstances determine who we become, to maintain love as a discipline rather than merely a feeling that comes and goes with fortune. This was emotional mastery of such completeness that it transformed an instrument of torture and shame into a teaching moment about the nature of true strength, about where real power resides in the universe, about what it means to be human at the highest pitch of what humanity can achieve. His death was not the sacrificing of a divine being who could not truly suffer, because divinity made him invulnerable to real pain, but the sacrificing of an idea embodied in a life, the offering up of everything he was in service of demonstrating that there is something in human nature more powerful than empire, more enduring than violence, more real than all the structures of domination that seem so permanent and unshakable until someone chooses to live as if love and justice and human dignity were more true than the illusions of power that empires rest upon. The legacy he left behind was not primarily supernatural claims or theological doctrines, though those would come later as people tried to make sense of what they had witnessed, but rather a philosophical and ethical framework that challenged everything the world believed about strength and weakness, about power and vulnerability, about what kind of life is worth living and what kind of death gives meaning to that life. The transcendence that emerged from despair was not escape from suffering, but transformation through suffering. Not the avoidance of pain, but the discovery that pain cannot touch the essential core of who you are if you refuse to let it determine your values and your choices. And this is perhaps the most radical and most challenging aspect of his legacy, that he does not promise to spare us from hardship, but shows us that we can remain human even when everything around us seems designed to strip our humanity away. The Stoic wisdom that we see so clearly in Marcus Aurelius contemplating mortality and duty, in Epictetus speaking about the dichotomy of control and the freedom that comes from accepting what we cannot change, in Seneca writing about the shortness of life and the importance of living according to our highest principles. All of this finds its most dramatic embodiment in the figure of a man who chose love when the world offered only the logic of violence and retaliation. Conclusion: the enduring model of human excellence. This narrative we have explored together is not an exercise in theology or an attempt to convert anyone to a particular religious doctrine, but rather an examination of what it means to be human at the highest level of integrity and courage, to see in a figure often obscured by centuries of doctrine and debate the outlines of a tragic hero in the classical sense. Someone who saw clearly what was required and chose to pay the cost rather than compromise the vision that gave his life meaning. He stands as a figure of the sage who understands that wisdom is not simply knowledge, but the courage to act on what you know even when action leads through darkness, who embodies the quiet strength that comes not from invulnerability, but from choosing again and again to respond to life with love rather than fear, with purpose rather than despair, with dignity rather than degradation, no matter what circumstances you find yourself navigating. The courage he demonstrated was fundamentally silent courage, not the loud bravado of someone who needs to announce their strength, but the quiet determination of someone who simply continues walking forward, because the alternative is to abandon everything that makes life worth living. And this kind of courage is available to every human being regardless of their circumstances or beliefs, because it requires not supernatural intervention, but only the decision to live according to principles that transcend immediate self-interest. His endurance in the face of suffering offers us a model not of escape from pain, but of presence within pain, of maintaining humanity precisely when all external pressures work to reduce us to something less than human. And this is perhaps the most relevant aspect of his story for anyone navigating the inevitable hardships that life presents to all of us regardless of our virtue or intentions. The leadership he embodied was moral leadership rather than positional authority, the kind of influence that comes from being willing to demonstrate through your own life what you ask of others, from never demanding a sacrifice that you are not willing to make yourself, from understanding that true change begins in the transformation of individual consciousness rather than in the manipulation of external circumstances through force or coercion. His vision required solitude, because genuine vision always separates you from the crowd that is content with conventional wisdom and comfortable lies. It required responsibility, because once you see clearly, you can no longer pretend ignorance or claim that the problems of the world are not your concern. And it required the willingness to be misunderstood, rejected, and ultimately destroyed by those who cannot tolerate the challenge that authentic wisdom presents to established systems of control. Perhaps the greatest strength we can derive from contemplating his life is not power over others or the ability to escape from the conditions of human existence, but rather the capacity to choose love in a world that seems to be ruled by fear, to choose meaning in a universe that appears indifferent to human concerns, to choose dignity when everything encourages us toward degradation, and to choose presence when it would be so much easier to numb ourselves against the pain that comes with truly being alive and awake to the suffering that surrounds us. If this story has moved something in you, if you have felt the resonance of ancient wisdom speaking to contemporary challenges, if you have recognized in this examination of one life the patterns that might illuminate your own journey toward wisdom and integrity, then I invite you to continue this exploration of what it means to live well, to suffer nobly, and to create meaning in a universe that gives us freedom but guarantees us nothing except the opportunity to choose who we will be in the face of whatever comes.